And here we are. Hello, Chris. How are you?
I'm good, good, and excited to do a special edition of Pull to Open, our very first special edition.
Me
Um,
too. Yes,
in
because we've
in response to something that's come up, and
yeah on the
very exciting thing.
socials.
Yeah,
Yeah. So for those of you who don't know, we're on TikTok. It's our most active social network. We're at Pull to Open, and we have just hit 1,000 followers. In fact, we've blown past it.
woohoo!
I'm super excited about that. So thank you everyone who's engaging with us there. So the reason we blew up on TikTok recently is we had a bit of a viral moment surrounding one of our clips from our 10th planet commentary, or commentary on the 10th planet.
Hmm.
And um, there was a lot of response to when we talked about that Cyberman's changing appearance. It was mostly me talking about it. And I feel the need to address the comments because there were a lot of people who seemed to take issue with my assertion that they never acknowledged the Cyberman's change in opinion appearance.
Right. So just to recap, what you
Mm,
said in the podcast and in the TikTok clip was that it's never really acknowledged in the show.
right.
Right? That there are different versions of Cybermen almost every time they appear. There's something slightly different about them.
And I kind of misspoke there because it's true they do address this, but it is a very recent development.
Yes.
This is first really addressed in an explicit way
Mm.
in the Doctor Falls, and
Yes.
that's a very recent episode. But it is done. I mean, they do talk about it, and that there's this parallel evolution theory. And I will say a lot of like what people take from that is mostly implied. Like the Doctor never actually points out this Cyberman is this or this Cyberman. I mean, they do talk about the Mondasian Cyberman, but there's a lot of
Hmm.
like, oh, kind of like as an audience member, you kind of have to come halfway a little bit. Like, I get it now, and now I see why there's different Cybermen. It's there, but
Right.
there's a great deal of it is kind of like you put it together, guys.
Yeah.
So
And this is a very belated thing that comes right at the end of the Moffat era. Literally, one episode away from the end of Moffat.
So,
Uh,
so in my defense, I was speaking more from sort of a classic series stance. As a person who
yeah.
grew up watching the classic series, seeing these Cybermen change appearance a lot, and it never really being talked about. It's just kind of a thing, and that's obviously, from what I said in the podcast, it is true. I mean, it was really production value decisions they were making, and they were just fans would make up what they want
Hmm.
at that time, but they never really talk about like, oh, these Cybermen from Earthshock look different from the Cybermen from the Moon Base or whatever, and they look so different that it's kind of obvious that's what they were doing because you would think that we did the 10th planet that if Ben and Polly encounter them in the Moon Base, if this was a thing within the show, they would say so. They say, "Holy crap,
Mm.
the Cybermen! These are the Cybermen," but I mean, they sure look different from the Cybermen we saw in at Snowcap. But they never do because it's just, oh, we get it. You just designed new costumes because you had more money.
Yeah, and there's and that's sort of normal behavior for a show that people tended not to rewatch. Right?
Yeah.
It was not so easy to rewatch these things. Certainly not in the '60s when the Cybermen were born. Um, but that said, it's very similar to what Star Wars does in its various iterations of stormtroopers. Like we don't
True.
get any explanation for why you know different forms of like snow troopers are just different when they arrive on
Mm-hmm.
Hoth. We don't know why. We can guess fairly easily. We can make up our own headcanon. But really, the only difference between stormtroopers in Star Wars and Cybermen and Doctor Who, in terms of what you're talking about, is that with Star Wars you get the action figures everywhere to tell you what this different
Right.
version is called. Like, and there's a whole backstory that comes with the merchandise. Uh, Doctor Who being a thing that people don't necessarily collect so much on the merchandising side of things, although it is increasingly a thing. Um, like that was never there was never an explanation. You just had to make it up in your own head from year to year. If you were paying attention to the point where you knew that the Cybermen looked different every time they showed up,
Mm-hmm.
um, then you would have to come up with some rationale for that.
Yeah, well,
And
this is the thing, and this is kind of what I was actually getting at in my original
yeah,
commentary. Not that you couldn't put together that they were multiple races of Cybermen or multiple ways they emerged. A theory that was, I guess, probably a fringe theory back in the day, and certainly became increasingly popular. It was actually really first put forward in the universe of Doctor Who in Cyberwoman. There's dialogue in that Torchwood episode from Jack Harkness,
hmm
when he talks about how worrisome it is there is this cyborg, this version of a Cyberman in their base, because this is how it could start. This is how the Cybermen start. He even says this is like, all it takes is one, and then they spread like an infection, and which is was kind of a new idea at the time. And then the Doctor sort of builds on that, and the Doctor Falls and talks about that. That's essentially what happens. They just emerge whenever there's a certain level of technology in a civilization.
hmm
So all that said, so what I was really kind of trying to get at, though, is kind of, I'm glad you brought up the snowtroopers, stormtroopers, because it's a great analogy. I was trying to get at, like, well, if they look different, shouldn't they have different abilities and different upgrades, and shouldn't that be more clear that like if this is say I believe it was in Ascension of the Cybermen, right? The most recent episode,
hmm
someone says, "Oh, these are warrior class Cybermen," and I kind of like, well, that sounds like a really meaningless distinction with the Cybermen. Like, what Cyberman is not a warrior class, right? That we've ever seen. This is like,
those
do
other
we?
Cybermen, they just didn't match up. They were training camp. They're not actually graduated.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, but I'm just like, where's the Brick Lane Cyberman? Like, where's that guy? Maintenance class Cyberman. I mean, like, where I imagine they have them. Like, let's see them and see what they're like. We should. In other words, I was kind of getting at, like, if there's different Cybermen and they look different, can we be a little more explicit about how their abilities change? Like,
Mm.
maybe these ones have more armor. I said even in the podcast when we were talking about it, like, some of them might be immune to gold and some of them might not be. Some of them might have just really badass weapons, and if they do, like, show that, right? And I think, honestly,
Mm.
this is one area where I think the Daleks went there, which was in a very effective way with the special weapons Dalek, like, where
Mm.
it's made 100% clear, oh, that's why this thing looks different. It's just a big freaking cannon, and it's designed only for that. And that made a lot of sense. Whereas the Cybermen, I mean, if you look at them, sure, they look different, they look cooler or less cool, but they're all pretty much the same in terms of
Yeah.
abilities. They all kind of march, they all kind of have a weapon, and whether it's handheld or built in. And I would say probably the only time, not the only time, but the most clear time they went out of their way to show new abilities in the Cybermen was Nightmare and Silver.
Yeah.
And Neil Gaiman, who wrote that episode, was very clear about that. That was one of his goals. It's like, well, he talked about how his iPhone looked different from his iPhone from a few years ago, and his laptop looks completely different from the first one he ever had. So it's like, why wouldn't the Cybermen start actually upgrading themselves and giving themselves new abilities? And they kind of show that. But then it's that sort of highly adaptable Borg-like Cyberman is never really seen again, which is
Yeah,
too bad.
and it's hard because I mean, Nightmare and Silver is very hard to watch for me because it's so clear that it was meant to be 2 episodes, and
Right.
we'll get the randomizer will take us there, um, of course, but it's so squished. It does not do justice to Neil Gaiman's vision of the Cybermen, which is very
Yeah.
unfortunate.
Yeah, agreed. I mean, it's lots of great ideas put forward, not really realized super well. But we'll get to that
Mhm.
when the randomizer takes us there. But anyway, I wanted to just kind of also just qualify everything I'm saying here. I really love the engagement from our audience on all
Yes.
this. Just to kind of wrap up, I mean, on the like, clearly there's a passionate group of super fans, and I think it's hard to not find super fans in today's franchises. You're either kind of all in or not, and but they're so all in, and I really like that they're keeping us honest out there,
Yeah.
making sure that they want to engage with what we're putting out there. But I just want to say, yes, I've seen the Doctor Falls, I've seen it all. I like to consider myself an authority on the cyber race. I've got David Banks' book from the 80s. I've read, I
Right.
think, all the Cyberman novelizations. I got a voice changer helmet. Okay, I like, yes, I think a lot about
Well,
the Cybermen more than your average person or even your average Doctor Who fan. So, I just wanted to be totally out there, and like, I really appreciate the engagement. And it also, I wanted to say, it demonstrates, this is, we have a podcast, right? It's not like
mhm.
we clip it for the TikTok channel, but it's like, I think, we even talked about the Dr. Falls in our podcast, right? Like, and
We
Bold
did.
Enough in Time. And it's difficult sometimes to pull some of these clips out of context, but I think, well, this is a good reminder to be a little more mindful of that, so that um
Well,
we
I'll say
cover.
a couple of things that you
Yeah.
in this clip that you took. You also managed to bring in the Star Trek fans, which is impressive. It's very impressive. You got the issue of, like, it not really being addressed when the Klingons change from the how they look in the original series to how they look in TNG. And as someone pointed out, well, yes, they do sort of go back and address this in DS9 in that special time travel
Mm.
episode where they go back to the original Klingon episode. Um, so it
Well,
is.
I think that shows, like, just kind of how, like, wonderful, like, franchises expand in this sort of,
Mhm.
in this way, right? Because it's like they take things, like with both the Klingons case and the Cybermen's case, they took these sort of production level decisions and designs, and then years later decided to spin up like whole theories and cool stories. You could argue the merits of any individual story, but it's like, they take that, hey, this thing that was clearly an error,
Mm.
it's now like kind of a cool thing we're exploring. Or not really an error, but I mean, it's like a thing that was not made to be a story element. So I love that, and I love that sort of
Mhm.
aspect of modern fandom. And I think it's not just a thing in modern fandom. I think I forget when we talked about this, but like in the Adventure in Space and Time, my favorite
Mhm.
moment probably in the whole movie might be when William Hartnell's granddaughter catches one of his fluff lines as he's saying it. He's
Mm.
like, "You said gloves, grandfather," and what he meant to say, like, something else, doves or whatever. And he kind of,
Mhm.
Hartnell's watching. He's kind of painfully, like, he's like, "Oh yeah, I did."
Yep.
And she said, "Well, that's because you had special gloves to defeat the Daleks." It's like, she's already making up her own headcanon, right? And he kind of rolls, "Oh yeah, that's what I meant," right? Like, so it's this really cool way that we've evolved in terms of fan culture, where
Mm.
you can have that aspect of it now sort of weaved into the show itself, because the person who was watching the granddaughter, and probably her granddaughters now, are now like, grew up with the show and are fans of the show and are making the show. And that's such a wonderful thing to see, like, these franchises, how they've done, taken these moments and turned them into like very rich pieces of storytelling.
Yeah, Doctor Who's very good at getting meta in a lot of ways, but it has never been as meta as Star Trek is in that Deep Space Nine episode, when they literally go back to an old episode and hang out in the backgrounds. And yes, it was sort of a massive technical feat for them to be able to do that. But thinking about it now, looking back at it now, it makes me wish that Doctor Who could do that. I mean, there's a show that could do that at any moment, right? The Doctor can
Mm.
look back on himself and just sort of hang out in the background and watch himself take on the Cybermen for the first time, for example, which I guess they kind of got close to in Twice Upon a Time. They
That would be, yeah.
almost touch on that. Um, but there's never been that moment of, right, Doctor Who explicitly saying we're going back to an old episode, we're going to revisit it, and we're going to provide a new layer of canon to this by seeing it again. Um, it is much more of a skittish show. It moves on very quickly. We've talked about that in the past, of like, perhaps it moves on a little too quickly, and perhaps it hits the reset button a little too easily. Um,
Hmm.
and I'll also say that with the Cybermen in particular, one advantage that the Daleks had was that they had Terry Nation in their corner, always trying to develop them as a separate show, right? That's what he
Right.
was doing in the US in the 60s and 70s. Really thought that there was an opportunity there. More power to him. But also, he was like writing that great comic strip about the Daleks that was revealing this whole backstory to them, with the Emperor Dalek, and the politicking on Skaro.
Mm.
And we never had that for the Cybermen, right? There was no Cybermen comic strip. Kit Pedler created them, but didn't really follow up in terms of like, here's all the backstory. Here's the development of the Cybermen history and politics and culture. So we still only have what we see through the show and occasional comic books and stuff like that. We don't
Hmm.
really have that sense of the Cybermen as an autonomous singular race. They
Right.
show up in the Doctor's timeline every now and again and present a threat. Um, and there's not that much more to it. So I think that's what I took from your comments. That's what I'm taking away from this lively discussion, is
Yeah.
that people like it when that there is more of what there was in the Doctor Falls, recognition of building the Mondasian Cybermen into the canon, and we would just love to see more of that.
Yeah, I think we're completely united in that, and that's
Mm.
ultimately where my comments were aimed at. I want to see the Cybermen more fleshed out, more explored. I think the Doctor Falls really opened up a lot of possibilities, in terms of which Cybermen's are from where, and you could actually start, you could do a pretty fun sort of tree of life or flowchart of the Cybermen, and I'm sure, I mean, it's been done, but I mean, now with this sort of new perspective that they just kind of emerge in places, I think you could do it, and in a really interesting way. And not that I want the show to be completely super nerdy and like, it should always just tell good stories, but taking elements of those things in the same way that they've taken bits and pieces, tiny pieces, sometimes bigger pieces from like the books and novels and the Big Finish stuff, and seeing those um, acknowledged and fleshed out a bit. I think I just love to see more of it. And
Mhm.
yeah, yeah, all
And it
power
is
to it.
unfortunate that the last time we saw them, post the Doctor's Falls, when there could have been more of that, they were really they had to fight for screen time in
Mm,
Ascension of the Cybermen and the Timeless Children, because there was this whole other vastly important, canon changing thing going on. So once again, the
mm.
Cybermen got short shrift.
Yeah, yeah, they really got to get a better agent. So we got to call it up like Chris Chibnall, like, hey man, we really just need more screen time on this. Come on, can you do something like someone with black handlebars? I don't know. We just need it. Let's get let's screw it. Let's do gold handlebars. That'd be huge. Anyway, so
Yeah, let's
good times, good times. All
yeah,
right. Well,
let's
thanks,
see
Chris.
something. Let's see something more like
Yeah.
Scarrow. Yeah, yeah. Let's see that politic in the background. I love that stuff. All right, well, I guess this has been our special edition, our
Indeed.
special cyber edition of Pull to Open.
All hail the Cyber Emperor. All hail the Cybermen TikTok fans. I'll say that. Those guys are
Right.
pretty awesome.
You are cyber masters, everyone.
Absolutely. All right. Thanks, guys.